Okay. Okay. Hey everyone, it's Jess. Today I'm a bit nervous coming on camera actually. Today I wanted to do a care video on my Cissus Discolor, which is this beautiful plant here. From what I've seen, pronunciation is actually Cissus, so with a K, but I think I've been calling it Cissus for a long time, so I will probably be still referring it to the Cissus Discolor. In my past couple of videos I've been saying I will do a plant care video for this house plant, and yeah, sorry guys, it's taking me I think a couple of months to actually do it. I know guys, sorry, I feel like every time I come on camera I apologize for not being around or not posting consistently on my channel, and I'm really sorry about that. It's something I'm going to be working on for 2021, just to be a little bit more consistent with posting. I guess what else has been happening? Oh, I got a new haircut. I mean, what do you guys think? I'm starting a new job on Monday, which I'm pretty excited about, and I decided on the Friday to get a haircut, and I thought I'd just change it up and go for something a little bit different. And then in hindsight I realized that was a pretty risky move, because I don't know if you can tell, but I've got a lot of layers at the moment and my hair gets quite frizzy, so layers are not often a very good thing. And at one point I was just worried because I was like, has she given me a mullet? It's a little bit more shaggier. I thought it's quite nice. Anyway, so back to the plant, to the care video. So the Cissus Discolor is also known as the Begonia Rex vine, and that's because it's got these beautiful leaves. The foliage and the leaves are very reminiscent of begonia leaves because they're quite velvety to touch as well, and they're actually quite delicate, which a lot of begonia leaves share the same or similar characteristics. But this plant is not actually a begonia, it's actually a member of the grape family, and specifically the woody vine variety, or part of the Cissus genesis. So there's about 350 different other members of its family, so it's got a lot of cousins, but it is a part of the grape family, which I thought was quite interesting. And in fact you can see that this plant does have quite woody stems. That's a tip you want to keep in mind, because it should have woody stems. When it comes to troubleshooting the plant, these stems should actually feel quite firm to touch and quite rigid. So if you do find yourself having limp stems, that might be a sign your plant needs some extra TLC or some extra care. I wouldn't recommend this plant for beginners, because I do find at times this plant can be quite tricky to look after, and mainly from a troubleshooting perspective. This plant is less hardy than some of my other houseplants, like my philodendrons or my more common houseplants, but I find once you get the conditions right, it tends to be quite a self-sufficient plant and can grow quite quickly by itself. So I wouldn't recommend these for a beginner houseplant, but definitely once you've got the foundations of its living conditions well set, it is quite a rewarding plant because it does grow quite quickly. I'll get into the troubleshooting bits a little bit later. So I got this plant when it was probably 2 or 3 leaves, and in about I think 5 months or so, I got this plant in the winter, so I think August of last year. So 4 to 5 months, it's grown tremendously, and I'm very happy about that. I haven't measured him yet, but I know that these plants can grow quite long, I think up to 2 to 3 meters, which is quite insane. So these plants, they're native to the Southeast Asian tropical rainforests. I think they're quite common in Indonesia. Useful tip is always to keep the natural habitat of this plant in mind when it comes to care tips. Over the years, this plant has been increasingly popular as a houseplant because of this beautiful foliage. It's got this beautiful white silvery veining and a beautiful red underside, which you can see on some of the leaves here. Now as a houseplant, these look great in hanging baskets, as a trailing plant if you want to trail it around your room or above windows, or you can do what I do and put it up on a trellis. I've just got it on a tomato trellis right now that my dad got for me. From a lighting perspective, this plant likes bright indirect light. I keep him in a south facing window so it gets morning light and then afternoon light, but all of it is indirect light. And if we keep in mind its natural habitat, it lives in the rainforests where it will have a lot of shade and shelter from the canopy, and so we just want to replicate that in our homes. Keep this plant away from direct light because it will burn its delicate leaves. Sunburn can be characterized by having some quite brown, crispy leaves, and you'll lose the vibrancy in the color of the leaves if this plant has been sunburned or has too much sun. I also find that having bright light also enhances the foliage, so if you're finding your plant is looking a little bit dull or the silver is not coming through as much, try moving it to a brighter location and should help the foliage become more vibrant. East facing windows are great as well because that gives some bright morning light, which is great for this plant. Afternoon light is probably a bit too harsh. In terms of warmth for this plant likes to be quite warm. Again, it actually lives in the rainforest where it's quite warm. Temperatures of between 21 to I think 27 degrees works best for this plant. I did come across some websites which said that this plant could still do well in temperatures as low as 13 degrees, which is I think quite low. I haven't kept my plant at low temperatures because I do keep him indoors and he's in a quite sheltered location. This plant doesn't go into dormancy, so what that means is that if it gets too cold over winter it will die. So it's important to keep in mind this plant will grow even in winter, although it will be a little bit slow. This plant will grow throughout the year, so it doesn't have dormant periods, so just be a little bit more careful when it comes to winter time to keep this plant quite warm. I live in Sydney, so during the winter it doesn't get that cold, so it's not too troublesome keeping this plant happy indoors. But I think for people living in the northern hemisphere where it snows, I've heard terrariums are quite a good option to retain the humidity and the heat for this plant. So I've heard of people who have kept this plant in a terrarium before. In terms of humidity, this plant enjoys quite high humidity. The first time I actually came across this plant was when I went to the Kew Gardens in London, and I remember walking into that greenhouse and it was just hit with this wall of humidity. So humidity for this plant is between 70 to 85 degrees, which is quite high. I think I keep him in lower humidity than that, probably around 65. He does okay, but I do find during hotter days where it got quite warm, he did grow a lot quicker. So he did send out a lot of, I don't know if you can see here, but he did send out a lot of teeny shoots on days when it got quite warm. So keep that in mind as well if you want your plant to grow a lot quicker. Majority of the growth does come in spring or summer, and during this time you want to make sure you fertilize this plant. You can hold off fertilizing during the winter because it's not actively growing, but during spring and summer I fertilize this plant once every other week. I use a liquid fertilizer, which I'll show here, and I use this. I've recently been using this for most of my houseplants, and I have noticed that my plants seem to grow a lot quicker. So give this fertilizer out if you're interested. I also have slow release fertilizer as part of this plant's potting mix, so it does sit in that throughout the year. I think one thing to keep in mind is with fertilizing in general is under fertilize is better than over fertilize because you don't want to burn your plant. In terms of growth for this plant, its new leaves are teeny little baby leaves, and they come out quite dark, but then over time they'll start to develop their silver markings. You need to be careful when this plant is sending out new growth because its new vines are quite delicate and it takes some time for them to harden and become a lot more woody. In terms of soil for this plant prefers more dense soil, so it's a bit refreshing from my standard aeroid mix I use for most of my houseplants, which tends to be more aerated and more suited for epiphytes. This plant, as a member of the grape family, enjoys soil that's a lot more rich in nutrients and it has a higher organic matter content. So if you do have compost, that's great to throw in with this plant. In terms of the soil I keep him in, I still keep him in the soil that came to me in, and I think it's regular potting mix, but I did have a look around and see what soil other growers recommend keeping him in, and I've seen that generally it looks like 50% regular potting mix, 25% of perlite, and then 25% of peat moss. Now peat moss does add a lot more nutrient to your soil, which is why I understand it would be quite a good additive to your soil mixture. Always ensure that your soil is well draining, because one of the risks for any houseplant actually is root rot. So you do want to make sure the soil that you keep your plant in is well draining. In terms of repotting this plant, I've heard that every 2 years is a good rule of thumb, and repot it in a slightly bigger pot than it previously was. These plants tend to have quite small root systems, so even though your plant is starting to get quite tall and long, its root system is actually quite small, so you can get away with having a smaller pot for your plant. In terms of watering for this plant, it's recommended to keep the soil quite moist. I personally wait until the soil has dried out before watering again, and the reason for that is because the soil mixture is already quite water retaining. How I think of it is, if you're already thinking of keeping your soil moist, you might have a tendency to water a little bit more, but because the soil medium you're potting your plant in is designed to retain moisture, I feel like it's more conservative to just wait until you see the soil has dried out and then watering it again. Otherwise, I think you risk overwatering the plant or keeping it in boggy soil, which is not great. I personally wait until the soil has dried out, at least from the top, before watering it again. I think with any plant, it's important not to let your plant dry out, because once you water it again, there's a risk that you can get root rot. In terms of troubleshooting for this plant, I think a couple of things to look out for is leaf discoloration. So leaf discoloration is a great sign to show that something might be wrong with your plant. And so from a visual perspective, if your leaves to yellow, if you see some black or dark brown spots forming, that's normally a sign that there might be some fungal issues. Similarly, if you find that the tips of the leaf start to go brown, that's an issue to also look into. I find that there's two types of browning. The crispy type, which means that your plant is either too dry or there's not enough humidity, in which case you can increase the humidity for your plant. Or the other browning I see is one where it's actually not crispy, it's quite limp to touch, and also it's normally coupled with some spotting around the leaf. That is another sign that there could be some fungal issues with your plant. And whenever there's fungal issues, my first recommendation is always to check the root and the stem of the plant for root rot or stem rot, because that's something you'll need to address right away, particularly because this plant as a vine, a lot of its integrity and a lot of its health relies on the base of the plant. Another thing to look out for is the rigidity of the stems. As a woody vine, your stems should feel quite strong. If you do notice some of your vines becoming a little bit limp or a little bit mushy, that's another sign to watch out for. And again, I would also recommend checking the roots for that plant, particularly if it's coupled by any new growth that seems to be wilting or dying off. It's another sign to just make sure your plant is growing properly or that its root structure is quite healthy. Another sign to look out for when you're troubleshooting this plant is, even though the leaves are quite delicate in nature, if you do find some of your leaves become quite floppy or quite thin to touch, that's another sign that there's something wrong with your plant. And what I do is I always then check the roots to just make sure there's nothing wrong with the roots. It could also be that you're not watering your plant that much, or you've given it too much water. I know it's such a fine balance there, but I think with underwatering, I find that my plant tends to crisp up versus getting quite floppy. So that's something else to look out for. In terms of pests for this plant, I find that fungus gnats are probably my biggest pets, and I think the reason for that is because they're attracted to that rich organic soil for them to lay their eggs in. So I do find there's a lot of fungus gnats when it comes to this plant. If you take your plant out every week, make sure it gets enough. And also if you spray a bit of soapy water solution or keep a vinegar dish with sugar on the side, I do find that the gnat problem isn't too troubling to deal with. In terms of propagation for this plant, I haven't propagated this plant, so I don't think I can give any great tips for this plant, but I will leave some links to people who have propagated this plant quite successfully. I guess the one thing is that this plant will go from seeds, however it's not a plant that flowers a lot, so your best bet is through stem propagation. And what you want to do is you want to cut off at a big leaf, probably an older leaf versus a younger leaf, because it's a lot stronger. Put it in some from root hormone powder and pop it in some soil, and I reckon using the same soil as you do to pot up the plant is fine. You then want to keep it in quite a warm location, so some people keep them in plastic baggies with holes in them for ventilation, and if you keep it in a warmer location, so near a heat mat or near a heat source, I think you can see your roots anywhere between 4 to 6 weeks or so. But propagation, I haven't propagated this plant, so I can't really offer some great propagation tips. That's the care video I wanted to do on my Cissus Discolor. It's a very beautiful plant. I really love this plant because it's very beautiful, and it also brings back amazing memories of the first time I saw this plant when I went to Kew Gardens and laid eyes on such a beautiful specimen. So guys, let me know if you enjoyed this video. Let me know guys if you have any questions for this plant. I'll do my best to answer them. I think I'm a little bit more active on my Instagram these days, although still probably not as active as I should be, but please feel free to reach out to me there, or pop me a comment in the comment section below. But guys, I hope you enjoyed this video. I hope you have a lot of fun taking care of your grapevine, and I'll see you in my next one.